The most dangerous lies are the ones people applaud. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I was 72 years old when my own son introduced a stranger into our family and expected me to pretend I had never seen her before. It happened during my granddaughter Sophie's birthday dinner, a gathering held at Daniel and Melissa's large suburban home just outside Hartford, Connecticut. The dining room was filled with relatives, neighbors, and old family friends. Laughter echoed through the house. Music played softly in the background. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. Until the front door opened. Daniel walked inside wearing the smile he always used when he thought he was about to impress a room. Beside him stood a young woman I had never seen at any family event before. She looked to be around 29 years old. Well-dressed. Polite. Nervous. The room immediately fell quiet. Melissa stepped forward with a bright smile and wrapped an arm around the young woman. "Everyone," she announced, "we have someone special we want you to meet." I noticed the way Daniel glanced at Melissa before speaking. A quick look, almost like he was checking whether they were following the same script. Then he cleared his throat. "This is Ava," he said, "and she is family." The room erupted with curiosity. Questions flew from every direction. Some people smiled. Others looked confused. Sophie lowered her fork and frowned. I remained perfectly still, because unlike everyone else in that room, I had seen Ava before. Not at a family gathering. Not through Daniel. Not through Melissa. 6 months earlier, I had seen her sitting alone in a waiting area outside Richard Hale's law office. At the time, she had been speaking with someone on the phone. She looked upset. I remembered her clearly because she had accidentally dropped a folder and several documents scattered across the floor. I helped her gather them. We exchanged a few polite words. Then we went our separate ways. There had been no mention of my family. No mention of Daniel. No mention of any connection whatsoever. Yet now my son stood in front of 30 people presenting her as family. Something was wrong. I could feel it immediately. The evening continued. Ava told a few stories about herself. Melissa practically beamed every time someone welcomed her. Daniel stayed unusually close to her side. Meanwhile, I watched, listened, waited. Years of teaching history had taught me a simple lesson. People reveal more than they realize when they repeat a story often enough. During dinner, I caught Ava looking uncertain several times. She seemed less comfortable than everyone expected, almost as if she had been placed in the middle of something larger than herself. Then came the moment that truly caught my attention. One of Daniel's cousins asked a simple question. "So how exactly are you related?" Before Ava could answer, Melissa jumped in. "The details are complicated," she said quickly. The conversation immediately shifted elsewhere. Nobody seemed bothered. Nobody except me. Because honest stories rarely need rescuing. By the end of the evening, everyone appeared excited about the newest addition to the family. Everyone except Sophie and me. As guests began leaving, I watched Daniel place a protective hand on Ava's shoulder. Melissa smiled proudly beside them. The entire scene felt carefully arranged, deliberately managed. And standing there in that crowded dining room, I realized something that sent a chill through me. My son was not introducing a stranger into the family. He was trying to convince the family to accept a version of the truth that did not exist. The morning after Sophie's birthday dinner, I woke up with the same uneasy feeling that had followed me home the night before. Some people believe intuition is mysterious. I do not. At 72 years old, I have learned that intuition is often just memory recognizing a pattern before your mind can explain it. Ava was that pattern. I knew I had seen her before. I knew the version of events presented at the dinner did not fit what I remembered. And most importantly, I knew Daniel was hiding something. 3 days later, Melissa invited the family to brunch at her house. The invitation itself was unusual. Melissa rarely organized gatherings without a specific purpose. When I arrived, I immediately understood why. Framed photographs covered the dining room table. Freshly printed. Professionally edited. Family pictures from the birthday celebration. At first glance, they seemed harmless. Then I noticed something strange. Ava appeared in nearly every photograph. Not at the edge. Not in the background. Front and center. In one image, she stood beside Daniel and Melissa. In another, she sat between relatives she had met only days earlier. In a third, she stood next to Sophie while everyone smiled for the camera. Melissa floated around the room, proudly displaying them. "They came out beautifully," she kept saying. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. Then she picked up the largest frame and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. The photograph showed nearly the entire family gathered together. Ava stood directly beside Daniel. I looked more closely. My smile disappeared. Someone was missing. Me. That is odd, I said quietly. Melissa turned toward me. What is, she asked. I do not seem to be in this one. The room fell silent for half a second. Then Melissa laughed. Oh, that was just an accident. An accident? Perhaps. But accidents do not usually happen when someone carefully selects and enlarges a photograph for display. Before I could respond, Daniel stepped in. Mom, it is not a big deal. Not a big deal. The word stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Because it felt like more than a photograph. It felt symbolic. Ava had been present for one family event and somehow occupied the center of every image. Meanwhile, I had attended every birthday, graduation, holiday, and family milestone for decades. Yet somehow I had disappeared from the picture that mattered most. Later that day, I found Sophie sitting alone on the back patio scrolling through photographs on her phone. Do you think I am imagining things? I asked. She looked up immediately. About Ava? I nodded. Sophie hesitated. No, that single word got my attention. Why? I asked. She lowered her voice. Because Mom has been planning this for weeks. My heart skipped. Planning what? Sophie glanced toward the house to make sure nobody was listening. I do not know exactly, but Ava did not suddenly appear. Mom has known about her for months. I stared at my granddaughter. The afternoon sun warmed the patio. Children laughed somewhere down the street. Everything looked perfectly normal. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. Someone had rewritten part of the family story before the rest of us even realized a new chapter had begun. And for reasons I still could not understand, Ava seemed to be standing exactly where Melissa wanted her. Over the next week, I paid closer attention than ever before. The strange thing about family is that people assume history protects them from scrutiny. They believe years of trust make their actions invisible. Melissa seemed especially comfortable. The more she settled Ava into family life, the less careful she became. On Wednesday afternoon, she hosted a planning meeting for the annual Brooks Family Heritage Dinner, an event my late husband and I had organized for nearly 20 years. Traditionally, I handled the guest list, the family records, and the display of photographs documenting 4 generations of our family history. This year, however, things were different. When I arrived at Melissa's house, I found Ava sitting at the dining room table surrounded by old albums, handwritten notes, and framed photographs that had once been stored in my home. For a moment, I simply stood in the doorway. Melissa looked up and smiled. Perfect timing, she said. Ava has been helping us organize everything. Helping. The word sounded harmless. Yet I noticed something unsettling immediately. Ava was holding one of my husband's journals. Not a valuable journal in terms of money, but priceless to our family history. Where did you get that? I asked calmly. Melissa answered before Ava could speak. Daniel picked up several boxes from your attic last weekend. I turned toward her. Without asking me. Melissa's smile tightened. We assumed you would not mind. Assumed. Another word that had become far too common lately. Ava looked uncomfortable and carefully placed the journal back on the table. For the rest of the afternoon, I watched. Every time someone asked a question about family history, Melissa directed it toward Ava. Every time a decision needed to be made, Melissa invited Ava's opinion. It was subtle enough that most people would not notice. I noticed. By the end of the meeting, Ava had somehow become involved in decisions that family members usually discussed with me. Driving home, I felt more troubled than angry, because something still did not fit. If Ava were part of some elaborate scheme, why did she look nervous every time attention shifted toward her? Why did she avoid speaking whenever questions became personal? 2 days later, I got another clue. Sophie stopped by unexpectedly after class. She carried her backpack and a concerned expression. Grandma, I heard something weird, she said. We sat at the kitchen table while she explained. Earlier that morning, she had overheard Melissa speaking with a friend on the phone. According to Sophie, Melissa had proudly said, "Soon everyone will accept the new version of the family." The phrase immediately caught my attention. The new version of the family. Not an addition to the family. A new version. Those words lingered in my mind long after Sophie left. That evening, I pulled out an old photo album and began turning pages. Birthday parties, graduations, anniversaries, decades of memories. As I studied the photographs, a realization slowly formed. Melissa was not trying to help Ava fit into the family. She was trying to rearrange the family around Ava. And for reasons I still could not understand, Daniel was helping her do it. Somewhere inside that mystery was the truth. I simply had not uncovered it yet. The following Sunday brought the confrontation I had been avoiding. Daniel stopped by my house unexpectedly just after lunch. He arrived carrying a cardboard box filled with old photographs and family records. At first glance, it looked like a thoughtful gesture. The moment he set the box on my kitchen table, however, I understood it was something else entirely. Melissa thought these might be useful for the heritage dinner, he said. Useful. Another word that had started losing its meaning. I opened the box and immediately recognized several items that had been removed from my attic without permission. My husband's handwritten notes, family scrapbooks, historical records dating back 3 generations, pieces of our family story. Daniel, I said carefully, why are these at your house in the first place? His expression tightened. Mom, we talked about this. No, I replied. You informed me after the fact. The room fell silent. For a moment, I saw something flash across his face. Guilt. Then it disappeared. You are making too much of this, he said. Everyone is trying to help. Help. I was beginning to hate that word. Then explain Ava. His eyes narrowed immediately. What about her? Who is she really? I asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. She is family. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly, like a line he had practiced. How? I asked. What is the actual connection? His jaw tightened. It is complicated. There it was again. The same phrase Melissa used whenever questions became uncomfortable. I stared at my son and realized something painful. He was not protecting Ava. He was protecting the story. Whatever the truth was, maintaining the narrative seemed more important to him than being honest with me. After several minutes of tense conversation, Daniel finally stood to leave. Before reaching the door, he turned around. You need to stop treating Ava like an outsider. I almost laughed. That would be easier if anyone would tell me who she is. He left without answering. 2 days later, another strange development occurred. Melissa announced that Ava would be giving a presentation during the heritage dinner. The announcement spread quickly through the family. Several relatives thought it sounded wonderful. I thought it sounded absurd. For 20 years, family history presentations had been my responsibility. Nobody had asked whether I wanted to step aside. Nobody had discussed the change with me. The decision had simply been made. That evening, Sophie came over carrying her laptop. You need to see this, she said. We sat together in my living room while she showed me social media posts from various family members. To my surprise, several recent photographs already referred to Ava using titles normally reserved for long-established relatives. The shift had happened remarkably fast, faster than felt natural. As I studied the posts, another detail caught my attention. Nearly every photo had been uploaded by Melissa. Nearly every caption had been written by Melissa. Nearly every narrative came from Melissa. It was not organic. It was curated, constructed, managed. Sophie noticed the same thing. It feels like someone is introducing a character into a story, she said quietly. Her words sent a chill through me because they perfectly described what I had been feeling for weeks. Ava was not simply joining the family. Someone was actively rewriting the family narrative around her. And the deeper I looked, the more I became convinced that Ava herself might not fully understand the role she had been given. The humiliation became impossible to ignore during the final planning session for the heritage dinner. For 2 decades, I had been responsible for organizing the historical display that greeted guests when they entered the event hall. Every family photograph, every timeline, every framed document had passed through my hands. It was more than a tradition. It was a record of who we were. When I arrived at Melissa's house that Saturday afternoon, I immediately sensed something was different. Large display boards covered the dining room table. New photographs had been mounted. Labels had been printed. Decorative arrangements had already been planned. Melissa stood proudly in the center of it all, while Ava sat nearby reviewing notes. Several relatives were helping assemble the displays. Nobody had told me preparations were this far along. Perfect, Melissa said when she saw me. You can take a look before we finalize everything. Finalize. Not discuss. Not review. Finalize. I walked toward the display boards. At first, everything appeared normal. Then I noticed the changes. Entire sections of family history had been rearranged. Important photographs had been moved. Captions had been rewritten. In several places, Ava appeared prominently despite having entered the family story only weeks earlier. Then I reached the central display, the one that traditionally highlighted each generation's contribution to the family. My stomach tightened. My husband's photograph remained. Daniel's photograph remained. Sophie's photograph remained. Mine had been reduced to a small image in the corner. Meanwhile, Ava occupied nearly the same amount of space as family members who had spent decades building those memories. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Melissa approached with a satisfied smile. "What do you think?" she asked. I looked directly at her. "I think somebody has been editing history." Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Melissa laughed lightly. "We are just modernizing the presentation." Modernizing. Another convenient word. Before I could respond, Ava spoke for the first time. "Actually, I told Melissa some of it felt uncomfortable." The room went silent. Melissa's smile disappeared for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but I caught it. More importantly, so did Sophie. Ava continued carefully. "I did not think I should be included in so many sections." Her voice sounded sincere. Not defensive, not manipulative. Sincere. For the first time, I saw genuine confusion in her eyes, as though she did not fully understand why she had been placed at the center of everything. Melissa immediately interrupted. "You are being modest." Then she quickly redirected the conversation. But the moment stayed with me. Later that evening, Sophie came to my house carrying a notebook. She looked excited. "I found something," she said. We sat down at the kitchen table. According to Sophie, she had reviewed older social media posts and family event records. Ava's connection to Daniel and Melissa stretched back much farther than anyone admitted publicly. Not years, but certainly months before the birthday dinner where she had supposedly been introduced. "Grandma," Sophie said quietly. "They knew her long before they told us." I stared at the notes spread across the table. The evidence was not complete, but a pattern was emerging. Melissa had been preparing this introduction long before the rest of the family ever met Ava. The question was no longer whether something was being hidden. The question was why. And for the first time since this strange story began, I started wondering whether Ava was truly part of the deception or simply caught inside someone else's plan. The breakthrough came from the person I least expected. 2 days after Sophie shared her findings, my phone rang just before noon. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something made me answer. "Mrs. Brooks?" a nervous voice asked. I immediately recognized it. "Ava." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that surprised me. "Could we meet?" An hour later, we sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Ava looked exhausted. The polished confidence everyone saw at family gatherings was gone. She seemed anxious and uncertain. After several minutes of small talk, she finally took a deep breath. "I think you know something is wrong," she said. I studied her carefully. "I think a lot of things are wrong." To my surprise, she nodded. "So do I." That was the moment everything began to change. Ava explained that Melissa and Daniel had approached her nearly 8 months earlier. They told her they had discovered a meaningful connection involving family history and wanted her help researching it. At first, she thought she was participating in a genealogy project. Then the situation slowly became more complicated. Invitations appeared. Introductions changed. Expectations grew. Before long, people were treating her as though she belonged in places she had never expected to occupy. "Why did you not walk away?" I asked. Ava looked down at her coffee. "Because every time I had questions, I was told more information was coming." There was genuine frustration in her voice. Not deception. Frustration. For the first time, I stopped viewing her as a potential threat. She looked more like someone trapped inside a story she did not fully understand. Then she revealed something even more important. Several months earlier, Melissa had arranged a meeting with Richard Hale. My attention sharpened immediately. Richard had been my family's attorney for decades. "Why?" I asked. Ava shook her head. "I do not know. But after that meeting, everything accelerated." That detail settled heavily in my mind. Richard was not someone who appeared accidentally in family matters. If Melissa had sought him out, there was a reason. When our conversation ended, Ava reached into her purse and handed me a folded sheet of paper. "I found this in a packet Melissa gave me before the birthday dinner," she said. I never understood why she included it. After Ava left, I unfolded the document. It appeared to be a partial family chart. Names, dates, relationships. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then I noticed several handwritten notes in the margins. Some sections had been altered. Other sections had been rearranged. Most disturbing of all, one branch of the family tree had been highlighted repeatedly. My branch. The notes were not written in Ava's handwriting. They belonged to Melissa. I stared at the page for several minutes. Suddenly, Sophie's observation returned to me. Melissa was not adding someone to the family. She was rewriting the family. That evening, I called Sophie and told her everything. When I finished, she sat quietly for several seconds. Finally, she said something that sent a chill through me. "Grandma, what if Ava was never the plan?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" Sophie's answer changed everything. "What if Ava is just the excuse?" That question stayed with me all night. What if Ava was only the excuse? The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Melissa had invested months shaping the family's perception. She had carefully managed introductions, photographs, stories, and events. If her goal had simply been to welcome a new relative, none of that would have been necessary. But if her goal was something larger, every piece suddenly fit together. The next morning, Sophie arrived carrying a folder and enough determination for both of us. We spread documents across my dining room table. Family photographs, event programs, social media posts, notes Ava had shared, the altered family chart. One by one, we started building a timeline. Within an hour, a pattern emerged. Ava's role in family events increased at exactly the same pace my role decreased. The birthday dinner, the heritage planning meetings, the family photographs, the public introductions. Each time Ava moved closer to the center, I moved further toward the edge. The realization left me cold. This was not about replacing a missing family member. This was about replacing a visible one. Around noon, Sophie noticed something neither of us had seen before. Several planning emails for the heritage dinner listed Ava as a presenter. That alone was strange. But what truly caught our attention was the description beneath her name. Future family representative. We stared at the phrase in silence. Representative of what? Sophie finally asked. I did not have an answer. Yet somehow, I felt we were approaching the heart of the mystery. Later that afternoon, I made a decision. I called Richard Hale. He answered immediately. After exchanging greetings, I asked a simple question. "Richard, did Melissa meet with you several months ago?" A long pause followed. Not the pause of confusion. The pause of caution. "Why are you asking?" he replied. That response told me everything. "Because I think my family is hiding something." Another silence followed. Finally, Richard spoke carefully. "Eleanor, some conversations are protected by confidentiality." My stomach tightened. Melissa had met with him. That much was now obvious. Before ending the call, Richard added something unexpected. "Be very careful about assumptions. Not everyone involved understands the entire situation." The statement echoed what Ava had already told me. More and more, it seemed the people participating in this story knew only fragments of it. That evening, I attended a small family gathering at Daniel's house. For the first time, I deliberately watched Ava instead of Melissa. What I saw surprised me. Ava looked exhausted. She smiled when spoken to. She participated when asked. But there was no sign of ambition, no sign of entitlement. If anything, she seemed increasingly uncomfortable whenever attention focused on her. Then something happened that changed my perspective completely. One of Daniel's relatives jokingly referred to Ava as the future matriarch of the family. Several people laughed. Ava did not. In fact, her expression fell immediately. She looked genuinely alarmed. Before she could respond, Melissa smoothly redirected the conversation elsewhere. Most people missed it. I did not. On my drive home, the pieces continued shifting into a new arrangement. Ava was not behaving like someone chasing power. She was behaving like someone carrying expectations she never requested. Which meant Sophie might be right. Ava was not the objective. She was the vehicle. The real target was still hidden. And for the first time, I began wondering if that target had been me all along. 3 days before the heritage dinner, everything accelerated. The strange tension that had been building beneath the surface suddenly became impossible to ignore. Melissa seemed more confident than ever. She moved through family conversations as though the outcome had already been decided. Daniel followed her lead without question. Meanwhile, Ava looked increasingly uneasy. The contrast was becoming difficult to miss. On Thursday afternoon, Sophie called and asked me to meet her at the university library. When I arrived, she was waiting at a study table surrounded by notebooks and printed records. Her expression told me she had found something important. "Grandma, look at these dates," she said. She slid several documents across the table. At first, They seemed unrelated. Event schedules, family newsletters, meeting announcements. Then I noticed the pattern. Nearly every major family responsibility that once belonged to me had been reassigned over the previous year. The changes were subtle enough to avoid attention individually. Together, however, they painted a different picture. Heritage planning, family records, historical presentations, community outreach. One responsibility after another had quietly shifted away from me. And recently, many of those roles had been redirected toward Ava. I sat back in my chair. This did not happen by accident. Sophie nodded. That is what I think too. For the next hour, we examined every document we could find. Then Sophie discovered something that made both of us freeze. Hidden inside an event planning file was a draft biography prepared for the upcoming Heritage dinner. The biography was intended to introduce Ava before her presentation. I read it twice, then a third time. The language was astonishing. It described Ava as a symbol of the family's future, a bridge between generations, a new voice carrying the family legacy forward. Not once did it mention me. Not once did it acknowledge who had spent decades preserving that legacy. The omission felt deliberate, more than deliberate, strategic. That evening, I returned home and found an envelope waiting in my mailbox. There was no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a meeting agenda. The document contained several names: Daniel, Melissa, Richard Hale, Ava Morgan. The meeting date was 8 months earlier, exactly when Ava claimed everything began. My pulse quickened. Someone wanted me to see this. More importantly, someone wanted me to know those meetings had existed long before the family introduction. I immediately called Richard. This time, he agreed to meet. We sat in his office the following morning. He listened quietly while I explained everything Sophie and I had discovered. When I finished, he folded his hands and stared out the window for several moments. "Eleanor," he finally said, "there are pieces of this situation that you still do not understand. Then help me understand them." His expression softened. "I cannot discuss confidential matters, but I can tell you this. Ava is not the person benefiting most from what is happening." The statement hit me like a thunderbolt, not because it answered my questions, because it confirmed my deepest suspicion. Ava was not the architect. She was not even the primary beneficiary. She was simply standing where someone else wanted her to stand. Before I left, Richard offered one final warning. "Pay attention during the Heritage dinner," he said. "Someone believes they are about to win." As I drove home, those words echoed in my mind. Someone believes they are about to win. For months, I had been searching for the truth about Ava. Now I realized I had been asking the wrong question. The mystery was never who Ava was. The mystery was who needed her there. The Heritage dinner arrived on a cool Saturday evening in October. For months, everything had been moving toward this event. The community center ballroom looked beautiful. Family photographs lined the walls. Historical displays filled the entrance hall. Round tables stretched across the room beneath warm lighting. Guests arrived dressed for celebration, completely unaware of the tensions hidden beneath the surface. As I entered, I immediately noticed Melissa standing near the stage greeting guests with unusual confidence. She looked like someone who had already achieved exactly what she wanted. Daniel stood beside her smiling proudly. Ava remained nearby, but even from across the room I could see the uncertainty in her expression. She looked less like an honored guest and more like someone waiting for instructions. Throughout the evening, relatives approached me with polite smiles. Several mentioned Ava. Several praised the presentation plan later in the program. More than one person referred to her as the future of the family. Every time I heard those words, I thought about Richard's warning. Someone believes they are about to win. An hour into the event, the formal program began. Melissa stepped onto the stage first. She welcomed everyone and spoke about family legacy, tradition, and the importance of embracing change. The speech sounded harmless on the surface. Yet every sentence seemed carefully designed to prepare the audience for something. Then came the moment Sophie and I had anticipated. Melissa introduced Ava. The room applauded warmly as Ava walked toward the podium. For a brief moment, I saw panic flash across her face. Then she began reading from prepared notes. She spoke about belonging, about finding connection, about honoring history while looking toward the future. The audience listened attentively. Several relatives appeared emotional. Melissa looked delighted. Daniel looked relieved. Then Ava reached the final section of her speech. Her voice slowed. She hesitated. Something was wrong. She glanced down at the pages in front of her and frowned. Then she looked directly toward Melissa. The room grew noticeably quieter. I am sorry, Ava said softly. There is something here that I do not understand. Melissa's smile froze. Ava lifted one page. This section describes me as the future representative of the Brooks family legacy. Several heads turned. I never agreed to that title. Silence spread across the ballroom. Ava continued. In fact, nobody ever explained what that meant. Melissa immediately rose from her seat. Ava, perhaps we should discuss this later. But the damage had already begun. For the first time, people were asking questions publicly. Real questions. Ava looked increasingly uncomfortable. I thought I was helping with historical research, she said. I did not realize I was being presented as something more. The audience exchanged confused glances. Melissa attempted to regain control, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Suspicion replaced celebration. Curiosity replaced certainty. Sophie looked at me from across the room. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. The false victory was starting to crack. Yet the most important revelation had not happened. Not even close. Because while everyone focused on Ava's unexpected confession, I noticed something else. Richard Hale had just entered the ballroom carrying a leather portfolio. He was not smiling. He was not surprised. And judging by the calm expression on his face, he had arrived prepared to reveal something that would change the entire story. The ballroom remained frozen in uncertainty as Ava stepped away from the podium. Conversations broke out in quiet whispers across the room. Melissa stood rigid beside the stage, struggling to regain control of an evening that had suddenly begun moving in an unexpected direction. Daniel looked equally unsettled. For months they had managed every detail carefully. Now the narrative was slipping away from them. That was when Richard Hale calmly walked toward the front of the room. His presence alone changed the atmosphere. Most people in attendance knew him. He had served the community for decades. More importantly, he had been connected to my family almost as long. Richard placed his leather portfolio on a nearby table and waited for the room to settle. Then he spoke. Before tonight continues, I believe several misunderstandings need clarification. The room fell silent again. Melissa immediately stepped forward. Richard, this is not really the time. He looked at her politely. Actually, Melissa, this is exactly the time. Something in his tone made everyone listen. Richard opened the portfolio and removed several documents. Not dramatic documents. Not sensational documents. Simply records. Agreements. Correspondence. Meeting notes. Facts. The kind of facts that become very uncomfortable when people have spent months building a story around assumptions. He began carefully. Over the last year, there have been discussions regarding family legacy projects, historical preservation efforts, and future leadership roles connected to those efforts. Several people nodded. Melissa folded her arms. Richard continued. Many individuals participated in those discussions. Unfortunately, not everyone was given the same understanding of what was actually being discussed. Ava stared at him. Daniel stared at him. Even Melissa appeared uncertain about where he was going. Then Richard revealed the first major truth. Ava had never been designated as the future representative of the Brooks family. Not officially, not legally, not historically. The title printed in her presentation draft had never existed in any approved document. Murmurs spread throughout the room. Ava looked genuinely shocked. What? She asked quietly. Richard handed her a copy of several records. You were invited to assist with research and historical projects. Nothing more. Ava scanned the pages. Her face paled. She looked toward Melissa. You told me the family wanted me to prepare for a larger role. Melissa opened her mouth, but did not immediately answer. That silence spoke louder than words. Richard continued. There is another issue. The room grew even quieter. Over the past year, multiple family events, publications, presentations, and historical materials were revised in ways that gradually reduced the visibility of certain individuals while increasing the visibility of others. Several heads turned toward me. Richard did not mention my name immediately. He did not need to. Everyone understood. The photographs, the displays, the introductions, the rewritten family narratives. Piece by piece, the pattern became visible. What had appeared harmless when viewed individually now looked very different when assembled together. Daniel finally stood. Nobody was trying to erase anyone. Richard looked directly at him. Intentions are often best measured by repeated actions. The statement landed heavily, because the actions were undeniable. The altered displays, the reassigned responsibilities, the public positioning of Ava, the gradual removal of my role from traditions I had maintained for decades. Suddenly the room was no longer discussing Ava. They were discussing something much larger. They were discussing why those changes had happened at all. Across the ballroom, Sophie met my eyes. For the first time all evening, I saw hope in her expression. Not because we had won. Not yet. But because the truth was finally beginning to emerge. And judging by the growing panic on Melissa's face, the most important revelation was still waiting to be uncovered. For several long seconds, nobody in the ballroom spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. Melissa stood near the stage, visibly struggling to maintain the confidence she had carried all evening. Daniel looked equally unsettled. Ava remained seated with the documents Richard had given her resting in her hands, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disappointment. Then Richard revealed the final piece. "There is one additional matter that must be addressed," he said. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He opened another folder and removed several pages. Over the past year, proposals were submitted regarding future control of the Brooks Family Heritage Foundation and its historical archives. A murmur moved through the audience. Most relatives had forgotten the foundation even existed. Years earlier, my late husband and I had established it to preserve family records, scholarships, and charitable projects connected to our family's history. It was never about wealth. It was about stewardship. Richard continued. The proposals recommended restructuring leadership authority and transferring significant decision-making responsibilities away from the current oversight structure. My stomach tightened. I already knew where this was heading. "Who submitted those proposals?" one relative asked. Richard did not hesitate. "Melissa Brooks." The reaction was immediate. Heads turned throughout the room. Several family members exchanged stunned looks. Melissa stepped forward. "That is not how this looks." Richard calmly handed copies of the documents to several relatives seated near the front. The records speak for themselves. Daniel's face lost color. He stared at the paperwork as if seeing it for the first time. Richard continued speaking. "The proposed restructuring would have significantly reduced Eleanor's role in future family decisions while creating several newly defined positions intended to oversee historical programs and public representation." Nobody needed an explanation. Everyone finally understood why Ava had been placed at the center of family events, why photographs had been altered, why traditions had been reassigned, why narratives had been rewritten. Ava had never been the destination. She had been the bridge. Melissa had been building an entirely new power structure while presenting it as family progress. The realization swept through the ballroom. "You used her," Sophie said quietly. The words were directed at Melissa. Ava looked toward her, then toward Melissa. "Was that true?" she asked. Melissa opened her mouth, but could not immediately answer. That hesitation destroyed whatever remained of her carefully constructed story. Ava slowly stood. "You told me I was helping preserve family history." Melissa looked desperate now. "You were." Ava shook her head. "No, I was helping you replace people." The room became silent again. This time, however, the silence belonged to the truth. Daniel finally spoke. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "Melissa, tell me this is not what happened." She looked at him, then at the documents, then at the faces surrounding her. For the first time all evening, she had no prepared response, no carefully crafted explanation, no script. And in that moment, the entire illusion collapsed. Not because someone attacked it, not because someone exposed a dramatic secret. It collapsed because the facts no longer supported the story. Across the room, Richard closed his folder. Sophie looked relieved. Ava looked heartbroken. Daniel looked lost. And as I sat there surrounded by 4 generations of family history, I realized something important. The truth had finally arrived. Now everyone would have to decide what to do with it. No one left immediately. People remained seated, as if standing up would somehow make the moment more real. The carefully constructed image that had guided the family for months had dissolved in less than an hour. Melissa sat silently at her table. Daniel remained beside her, staring at the documents spread before him. Ava looked overwhelmed but strangely relieved. For the first time since entering our lives, she no longer had to play a role she never fully understood. Richard gathered his papers and quietly returned to his seat. The truth no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the family. Then something unexpected happened. Ava walked directly toward me. The entire room watched. When she stopped beside my chair, her eyes filled with emotion. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. I shook my head. "No, you do not." She looked surprised. "I should have asked more questions." "Perhaps," I said. "But you were not the one rewriting history." For the first time since I met her, Ava smiled genuinely. Not the nervous smile I had seen at gatherings. Not the careful smile Melissa seemed to expect. A real one. Across the room, Sophie joined us. Without hesitation, she wrapped an arm around Ava's shoulder. The gesture seemed simple, but it carried a message everyone understood. The conflict had never been between Ava and me. That misunderstanding was finally over. A few minutes later, Daniel approached. He looked older than he had a month earlier. Regret has a way of doing that. "Mom," he said quietly. The room became silent once more. "I am sorry. There were many things I could have said. I could have reminded him of every warning he ignored, every conversation he dismissed, every moment he chose convenience over honesty. Instead, I simply asked one question. Did you know how far it had gone?" Daniel lowered his eyes. Not at first. His voice trembled slightly. By the time I realized it, I convinced myself it would all work out. I nodded. It was not a complete answer, but it was an honest one. Sometimes that matters more. As the evening ended, relatives began removing the revised displays and altered presentation materials. The original family records were restored. The historical exhibits returned to their proper form. More importantly, nobody argued when Sophie volunteered to help preserve them moving forward. It felt right. She had protected the truth when many others chose comfort. Several weeks later, the Heritage Foundation board met formally. The restructuring proposal was withdrawn. Leadership remained unchanged. New safeguards were added to ensure future decisions required broader family participation. For the first time in months, the future felt stable. On a cold November afternoon, Sophie and I visited the archive room together. Family photographs filled the shelves. Journals, letters, and records rested exactly where they belonged. As we organized a few boxes, she asked a question. "Do you think they were trying to replace you?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I smiled. "No." She looked confused. I pointed toward the shelves around us. "They thought history was something they could edit. What they forgot is that history remembers who built it." Months earlier, a stranger had been brought into our family story. In the end, she found her own place within it. Melissa lost the influence she tried so hard to control. Daniel began the difficult work of rebuilding trust. Sophie became the guardian of a legacy she genuinely respected. And I remained exactly where I had always belonged. Not because I fought for power, not because I won an argument, but because the truth eventually found its voice. And once it did, nobody could erase it.